All right, let's just, okay, great. Well, I think let's get started. So good morning, everyone, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Pratik Desai. I'm the Strategic Engagement Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. I'm the moderator for today's event, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this important discussion. We're really thrilled to be convening this discussion as an official side event of the 2021 ECOSOC Financing for Development Forum. And we're grateful to have the EU delegation to the UN and the permanent mission of the Netherlands to the UN for their partnership and their support in facilitating this event today. We have an outstanding panel with us today, and we'll be sure to introduce them in just a minute, but just wanted to maybe provide a little bit of context and color for why we're having this discussion today. Today's topic comes at a sort of a critical moment as we consider where we stand in the decade of action and the race to achieve the SDGs. With less than 10 years to achieve the goals, we know that the financial sector has an indispensable role to play in mobilizing the resources needed to finance a more inclusive and sustainable future. And we also know that this need has never been more acute. This last year and COVID-19 has really threatened to reverse important gains that we've made on SDG progress. And it's wrought havoc on the global economy, contracting it by over 4% in 2020 alone, and increasing the already significant SDG financing gap that existed pre-pandemic. Private capital for the SDGs has been trending downwards, and foreign direct investment flows were projected to decrease up to 45% in developing countries. And while there is some good news, the global economy is expected to grow by about 4% this year, our prospects at a green and just recovery will be weakened without adequate enabling environments that better allow financial institutions to mobilize, align, and scale up the private finance that's needed in this decade of action. So there's really never been a more opportune moment for the global sustainability disclosure standards ecosystem to come together and think about how to best meet the needs of both investors and broader stakeholders to incentivize the financial institutions to allocate their capital more effectively towards achievement of the SDGs. And we've also seen that movement is actually underway, largely around sort of three, if we were to cluster it, three trends. So first is the movement towards convergence among standard setting organizations. Many of the folks on this call will be familiar with the recent announcements by the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, or the IFRS Foundation, to support the creation of a sustainability standards board that would help to push for globally consistent, comparable, and reliable sustainability disclosure standards. Second of all, there's the move from voluntary to mandatory reporting. The EU has really led the way on this agenda via the Sustainable Finance Action Plan and the revised Non-Financial Reporting Directive. And we're really thrilled to be able to have a representative from the European Commission with us today to speak more to that in a little bit. And we're also seeing encouraging action from other governments and in other regions. So in Asia, as well as in North America recently, with the Security and Exchange Commission's recent call for public disclosure around mandatory climate disclosure. So the question of how we move now from encouraging regional best practice to global best practice is becoming more and more important. And then lastly, the trend that I think is important to note is that we've seen a movement in the need to improve the quality of standards. So we have good models already that I think we can build from, ranging from science-based targets, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, but we also need enhanced standards that are aligned with globally agreed upon goals and targets. And that's what makes the work that the UN is doing this week as part of the Financing for Development Forum, but also beyond when we think about how to maintain momentum on the Addis Ababa Action Agreement via the work that's happening in the second committee through the Sustainable Investing Resolution, and then as part of the broader FFD process. So I'm really pleased that we have a number of panelists with us today who represent different parts of the disclosure and reporting ecosystems, who will be able to share their expertise and experience with us about how to advance the agenda on this topic. It's a tight program, so I'll try to keep it brief, but thought it would be helpful just maybe at the outset to introduce all of them. So first up, very pleased to have Marcel Hogg, the Director of the Director for Horizontal Policies from the European Commission's Directorate General for Financial Stability, Financial Services, and Capital Markets Union, or DG FISMA. Next up, we have Andre Jacobs, the Senior Advisor for Strategy and Sustainability at ABN AMRO. Next, Tejal Modi, Managing Director and Head of Business Development and Strategy at Rabobank. Next, Shamila Subramani, Chief Sustainability Officer at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Marcos Neto, the Director of the Finance Sector Hub at the UN Development Program, UNDP. Paulina Murphy, the Engagement Director at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And last but certainly not least, I'm very, very pleased and honored to have with us Ambassador Joka Brandt, the permanent representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the UN. So we really look forward to hearing their insights soon, but maybe just a quick few housekeeping items to start with for all the attendees on the line. First, to note that this conversation today will be recorded and made available for public viewing after the event. We welcome you to please share your thoughts and amplify the content and insights that you hear from today's discussion on social media. You can use the hashtags FIN4, the number 4, DEV, and also hashtag sustainable finance. And you can also follow along with our live tweeting of the event at SDG benchmarks. And then also, please, would love to encourage dialogue and open conversation. We have 2 blocks for discussion during this session. So please do feel free to share questions via the question box, and we will try to get to as many as possible during the discussion blocks. So with that, would love to turn over to our first panelist, Marcel Hogg. Marcel, thanks for joining us today. The EU has really, as I said earlier, been leading on this agenda in many ways, most recently through the work of the NFRD and EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of what this process has looked like within the Commission, including some of the highlights and the challenges that still remain?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pratik. Let me start by thanking the World Benchmarking Alliance, the EU Delegation to the UN, and the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands to the UN for organizing this event. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. Our topic of today is of critical importance, and I'm pleased to see that there is such a wide international community attending the conversation. Pratik, you already said that we are facing 2 major challenges. The first is climate change, which remains an urgent threat despite all the efforts undertaken. And the second are the dramatic consequences arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. Both have serious negative effects on our economies and societies and are particularly severe for vulnerable populations. Policymakers have a high responsibility here. Depending on their fields of competence, they need to deploy the right tools and measures to address these problems. We cannot postpone the solutions. Future generations will otherwise have to pay a very high cost of our inaction. In the European Union, as you know, we have set ambitious sustainability targets with the European Green Deal, and notably a commitment to reach climate neutrality by 2050. To reach the European Green Deal objectives and to remain in line with our international commitments from the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals will require an enormous amount of capital. The public sector will obviously continue to play its role in funding our development needs, but the support of the private sector will be essential to succeed. This is why in Europe we adopted an action plan on financing sustainable growth already in 2018, and we've put sustainable finance at the core of our Green Deal priorities. Meanwhile, we have already put forward several initiatives. We adopted legislation that creates the framework for an EU-wide classification of green economic activities to guide green investments, the so-called EU Taxonomy. And we've also been working to considerably reinforce our ESG disclosure rules. Financial market participants already have to comply with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which will lead to more reliable financial products claiming sustainability. In a few days, we will adopt our revised non-financial reporting rules for companies. This legislation covers the full spectrum of ESG issues. It will inter alia include the development of potential mandatory sustainability reporting standards. We will adopt a framework for a voluntary EU green bond standard. This will give issuers of high quality green bonds, a reliable way to demonstrate their environmental commitment and alignment with the EU taxonomy. However, we're also facing challenges here that are by their nature global. To deliver on our shared goals, dialogue and cooperation between authorities, financial actors, civil society, and corporate actors will be crucial. This needs to happen across borders and within jurisdictions. We need to work together towards more aligned sustainable finance standards internationally, while at the same time paying due regard to national and regional specificities. With this in mind, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance was launched in 2019. The IPSF is a multilateral forum gathering today a critical mass of policymakers from jurisdictions representing around half of the world's population, greenhouse gas emissions, and GDP. The IPSF's activities are at the core of today's topic, as they focus on those areas that are key for investors to identify and seize sustainable investment opportunities, namely disclosures, taxonomies, standards, and labels. We believe this work can serve as an important contribution to the work of international standard setters by highlighting best practices, as well as comparing sustainable finance approaches and tools developed by its member jurisdictions. The important momentum for sustainable finance in international fora, particularly, but not only, with the re-establishment of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group is most welcome. International cooperation and better alignment of sustainable finance standards are certainly the core ingredients to mobilize the financial sector toward our shared goal of a more sustainable future. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marcel. And I really appreciate you being with us. I know you have to leave us early. So again, thanks so much for joining us and for the EU's leadership on this agenda. Next up, we'd love to turn to Andre from ABN AMRO. Andre, I think we heard from Marcel sort of how governments and regional jurisdictions are tackling these issues and helping to create that enabling environment for business, or in this case, financial institutions, to take action, which Marcel noted is so critically important. ABN AMRO has been a leader on sustainability, sustainable finance for quite some time, but how has sort of recent legislation from the EU either supported or enhanced the work that you've already been doing?
Thank you, Pratik. Thank you, everybody. I'll try to share my screen with you. First of all, I was very happy to hear Marcel tell the actions the EU has taken. As a sustainability man by heart, I'm advising for 30 years now on sustainability strategy. Before 20 years outside of the banking arena, last year within the banking arena. But there are obviously some attention points, because the actions the EU has taken, when you look at the comments, for instance, the Dutch Banking Association has sent back, but we have sent back to the EU. Obviously, I do believe in greening, and you need obviously standards. There is a complexity among the sustainable finance initiatives you see that come from the EU, and there should be alignment, we think. Not that the EU isn't working on that, but it's very important for companies to know what they are up against or what they have to fulfill. When you look at financing sustainable growth, the EU is taking the first steps. The next steps has to be taken by governments. And as a formal advisor of some governments, not only the Netherlands, but also from other countries in Europe, implementation isn't always going balanced, let's say it that way. Governments should develop transition paths, obviously, including social impacts. What will be very helpful is providing tax incentives. And then the last part, the most important one, is the data challenge. Banks need data from companies they finance to make decisions. When it's about non-financial data, it's still, the start of getting this data available. So I hope, I think, I expect maybe some sort of a centralized European ESG data register would be very useful if that could be achieved. That's from a EU perspective. Now, one step back, when you look at ABN AMRO, I'll say something about our perspective. What we are working on, I think, for 7 or 8 years now at ABN AMRO is long-term value creation. Thinking about it, trying to make it visible. In the last 3 years, we made the so-called impact report. Based on the 6 capitals you see here on the far left from the RRC framework, we tried to calculate the impact of our being, basically, of ABN AMRO. You see here our value creating model, as can be seen in our annual report. And what I really want to focus on is the dots on the far right of your screen. The light green are the positive impacts, the darker, of course, are the negative impacts. Based on many models, many international available data, general data, CBS data, combined with ABN AMRO data, we calculate the amount of impact we have from the perspective of our different stakeholders. That's a very important addition. So, from a client perspective, from our employees' perspective, from our investor perspective, and from society at large perspective. Going one step deeper into this in this overview, do realize, like I said, it's the perspective of the clients. And you see, we create value, we manufacture value for our clients. And again, we go to financial impact from a client perspective. It's dark. Why is it dark? Obviously, because they pay fees, they pay interest, they pay for our support, and so on. But do realize from the client perspective that's a voluntary effect. What is the most relevant and the most interesting, obviously, is what's happening there on the right bottom end from society perspective. When you look there, the effect on human capital, social capital, and natural capital, we're still scoring dark, which means we don't create value, but we destroy value. I think there's, that's the example I already told you about. But here, also from human perspective, you look at our employees. Employees invest a year's worth of value, time, and experience. So there are also cases of work-related health issues and external costs to employees. So there's a small negative impact for employees from a human capital perspective. Obviously, they get paid. You look at the financial effect to employees, they get paid. So there's a bigger financial positive effect. Do you realize that you can't add up all these different effects? And we try to calculate everything in euros. And we do it for bankers. Bankers understand euros, so everything has been calculated to euros. For instance, when you look here from we had a comparison here between 2020 and 2019. The business activities of our clients, because the majority of the effect we have as a bank is in our value chain. So when we buy from, and also what we do with our money when we lend it to clients. So we look at the business activities with our clients. They contribute to air pollution sometimes, land transformation, and climate change. So there you can see there is a negative impact. All this data has been assured because it's in our integrated report by our assurance provider for the 2nd year now. And with this, we try to create a relation between reporting, our internal strategy, because ABN AMRO has a strategy to want to be a sustainable bank. We have a sustainable strategy, that's something different than a sustainability strategy, combined with the stakeholder awareness. And there's only stakeholders outside of the bank, but obviously also inside of the bank. I can tell you this is even more useful when I talk to my colleagues, the hardcore finance people, then when I talk to other stakeholders like NGOs or society or government, because they do know already, they see what we do, but especially for people who are always used within a banking environment to do it in a certain way without realizing the overall effect in the whole value chain. This is very useful. This is very, I give a lot of trainings within ABN AMRO, and every time I tell this story, then I take more time than now, more than an hour, 1.5 hours, and there are a lot of questions. How is it possible we don't know this? Why don't we have this data available on a daily decision level? Because what you see now is on a total portfolio level of ABN AMRO. More than 80% of our total portfolio is already included in what you see here in front of you. But that takes one step extra, and we're working on that to have all these data, because behind all these 6 capitals, there are 53 indicators based on more than 15,000 data points. So it's a lot of modeling, a lot of work for a lot of people to get this report on this level. So the next step is, how can we get this on a day-to-day, daily decisioning level? So my goal is that what you see here on a portfolio level can become available in the upcoming years for my colleagues. So when they have to do a decision, do I lend a certain amount of money to a company or to a client? What's the effect? It's not like you can calculate it, but at least you can see it, what the effect is. It makes people think and realize what the effect of their daily business is. And hopefully, and not only hopefully, I do expect this will change gradually the way decisions are taken and the way things are built in risk models and so on. So this is an awareness tool, and also hopefully will become a day-to-day decisioning tool. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andres, and sharing this approach that ABN AMRO is taking. And I think really important to highlight the relationship, as you said, between disclosure and reporting and actually impact, because reporting for reporting's sake doesn't do anyone any good. So thanks for taking us through that. Tejal, I'd love to turn it over to you. I think you represent a unique perspective here because you work for a Dutch organization, but operate in the United States. And so there's a whole host of different challenges that you face when it comes to compliance and active engagement with your clients. How has sort of this unique way of operating influenced your views on the need for harmonization and alignment in disclosure standards to help better support the needs of your clients, who I think in many cases for Rabobank are smallholder farmers who are feeling the effects of the topics that we're talking about very acutely?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that, Pratik, and thank you to the World Benchmarking Alliance and to my fellow panelists for being a part of this really important conversation. Before I start, I just wanted to note that I will present my perspectives, of course, and they aren't necessarily the perspectives of Rabobank, but hopefully you will get a sense of our activities and the actions we're taking to support a stronger environment around disclosure and also around deploying capital towards the achievement of sustainable development goals. So a little bit about Rabobank for those of you who are listening or watching. Rabobank is a cooperative banking organization founded in the Netherlands in 1898, and the whole premise of the bank was to promote financial resilience in the agricultural sector. So around the world, as Pratik mentioned, and actually in 40 countries today, Rabobank is largely focused on food and agriculture finance. That is with smallholder farmers, but also with the largest corporations in the world, and very large farms and farmers, if you think about industrialized farms as well in developed economies. So our focus is on food and agriculture. We are deeply committed to sustainability, like Andre and our, many of the companies in the Netherlands, including ABN AMRO. Rabobank is deeply committed to sustainability, and we're proud to have been ranked by Sustainalytics in the top spot of 408 diversified global banks with respect to our own ESG risks. So taken very seriously at Rabobank. On the topic of disclosures, I should mention that Rabobank has been reporting on corporate social responsibility since 1997 with an annual report. In that year, our first report was around environmental management. So from a public standpoint, the bank does report and has for many years on our activities around sustainability and sustainability financing, as well as sustainability in our own operations. As I mentioned, our global strategic intent is to support feeding the world's population adequately and nutritiously by 2050. So we expect a population of 10 billion. And we think about how we as a bank can really deploy all of our resources, including capital, of course, towards achieving that end and helping our clients transition to more sustainable business models. With respect to the SDGs, that of course includes several of the goals in many ways. So we're talking about food security, equitable access to food and hunger alleviation, improving rural livelihoods of the agricultural and rural poor, environmental protections, access to nutrition, like I said, as well as food waste mitigation. Our chairman, Reba Dreyer, was an original champion of SDG 12.3 around food waste, which actually is a massive problem in the food system, which actually contributes to many other issues. We partner with many organizations towards these ends in the public sector as well, including the United Nations Environmental Program Financial Initiative and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, as well as in North America, organizations like the Nature Conservancy and the Environmental Defense Fund. So as Andre mentioned as well, this clearly is a multi-stakeholder area of interest. And, as a financial institution, not only do we look to our counterparts in our industry and our sector, but of course, across sectors and across, especially the public sector, and groups that are helping to, very importantly, help make investments towards data analytics and transparency, which of course the financial institutions we cannot do alone. So where do we hope to apply capital? So again, we're talking about from Rabobank's perspective, the value chain, of course, of a financial institution is the way Andre described in terms of raising funding, deploying that funding, and risk management. But in terms of the value chains we look at and the sectors we serve, let's say we look at agriculture, we're of course talking about farmers, we're talking about everything following that in the supply chain, logistics, processing, all the way down to what touches the end customer. And so the themes around sustainability, climate change, resilience, shocks, the fact that the organizations around this value chain have to invest in more sustainable technologies and operations, this is where the capital is going, right? This is where the financing is going. And, and again, it's small entities and large entities. Another area we're focusing on, which we think is very complementary, of course, to food and agriculture, is energy and renewable energy. So solar, wind, and other areas where waste can be converted into energy, and energy can be stored and deployed more efficiently and more sustainably. So another area, again, where we see the need for capital and infrastructure, of course, as we talked about, to combat climate change. To that end, so there's where capital can be deployed, right? And we talk about raising capital as a financial institution and going to the public markets to do so, the importance of disclosure there as well. And I did want to mention that very recently, Rabobank was awarded a distinction by Environmental Finance, their bond awards for 2021, for actually issuing the largest ever sustainable bond as a financial institution to raise capital towards projects within a sustainable framework that we developed, a sustainable financing framework that we developed and sort of revised last fall. And that sustainable framework actually outlines how we use our funds and capital towards projects in renewable energy, and then in the Netherlands in areas such as sustainable real estate, healthcare, and COVID-19 crisis support. So this bond actually, again, as I mentioned, was the largest of its kind, and the proceeds will be used towards renewable energy projects. And this, the bond was not only related, the framework is not only related to several UN Sustainable Development Goals, but was aligned as well with the EU Green Bond Standard and the EU Taxonomy. So again, in raising funds, it's important clearly that financial institutions are able to demonstrate where these funds will be deployed. Finally, we talked about, I think it's inherent, the role of financial institutions is in safeguarding and in risk management. And so when we think about our own internal risks and the risks that we take on and that we transfer to the rest of the economy, it's important to be able to identify, measure, and price sustainability risks. These are not financial risks, but how do we translate sustainability risks into financial risks so that we can have a sound financial system? And also, as we know, deploying capital is one thing, but to basically make markets accept and invest in these assets, and then ultimately to securitize and be able to create more liquidity around some of these really important investments, we need to have that transparency and people need to understand the risks. So to that end, we're very pleased to see, of course, regulators and agencies around the world really focused on this issue. And in North America and the United States, statements that have been put out by the Federal Reserve, the SEC, as you mentioned, the CFTC, and we look forward with working with these organizations in various consortia to be able to take this forward. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tejal. Really, really helpful, I think, to hear the practical example of sort of how Rabobank is taking these issues and thinking about it to drive system change on food and agriculture and the issues that go along with that. And I think you raise a really, I think, helpful reminder about the need to deploy financing across the value chain and what that sort of looks like, which I think can be difficult to sometimes actually conceptualize. So I think that was really useful. We have about 15 minutes for, well, a little less than 15 minutes now, maybe 12 minutes or so for discussion. I don't see any questions yet from participants, but reminder that if anyone does have a question for our panelists, to please share it in the Q&A box. Maybe one that I can start us off on. I think, we've heard from the panelists so far, Marcel, Andre, and Tejal, about the need for continued multi-stakeholder action on this agenda, the need for reporting to drive transparency and disclosure, and then after that, impact. But I think it's also important to mention that this movement isn't without its challenges or its skeptics. And I think recently there's been quite a bit of questioning about whether sustainability reporting is something that is not actually going to lead to systemic change, and if it's just something that is a lot of hot air. And so I would love to hear from anyone on the panel. What do you have to say to those critiques? How can we bring people along on this journey and help them to understand that movement might be slow, but it's not in vain? Anyone want to tackle that?
I have some idea about that.
You want to come in?
Yes, please.
Sure.
I totally recognize it, and that's why we stopped having a sustainability report. Because it doesn't mean we don't report about sustainability, but if you put it in a sustainability report, it's something extra. That's how it is perceived. Something extra. Oh, that's been made by the sustainability department. So that's not really about banking or really about business. It's about sustainability. When you merge sustainability into your strategy, into your main reports, and you balance it like we do with the IRC framework, but there are also other very good, useful frameworks. You balance it with other what business people think is relevant. Then you see, from a stakeholder perspective, that these sustainability topics are in the top 10 of relevant topics, according to investors, society, our clients. And then our colleagues, they will start talking differently, because then they start to realize, oh, maybe it is more important than I think it is. So only look at a sustainability report as something relevant, then those things happen. I saw this 25 years ago with some pre-sustainability reports, and you see it now again. So we decided to stop with that, but doesn't mean the sustainability report is without value. Yes, they're very valuable because of the information given, but if you can't balance it with business issues, then it loses value.
Yeah, great. Really important point, Andre. I think, Marcus, it looks like would you like to respond?
No, yes, thank you. And thanks for the colleagues for the interventions, and for World Benchmark Alliance for inviting me, but also for the work you do, trying to create integrity into this whole conversation through your benchmark work. I think Andreas' example is very good, right? The more financial institutions, the more companies bring these into their core business rather than this niche thing in the corner, the better. And I think that is where the regulatory frameworks that we heard from Marcel on the EU and other become very important, right? Look, there is growth in sustainability finance, but it's less than 10% of the entire world of, of finance. We have $1 trillion in green bonds. Fantastic. It's less than 2% of the bond market, right? So I think part of the challenge that we have is how do this not evolve, right, as an innovative niche product, and over time, and let's be honest, in a fast pace, right? How does this become the financial system? So, in a few years, we don't need to talk about sustainable finance because all finance needs to be sustainable, right? And I think we are still in that element that we are not there, right? And the pace of change is not fast enough to the challenges that we have. And the incentives and the disincentives, let's put that way, the carrots and the stick, are still very much for the creation and establishment of a growing, large niche market, but not for full systemic transformation. And then you have the risk of washing. You have the risk of, if you don't tighten the rules, if you don't tighten what is ESG, what is net zero, what is those things, if those are not tightened, I think we face a risk that even this niche market get discredited relatively soon.
Yeah, if I can add something, I think these are really good points, and we have to be cognizant that this is a perception. I think what's not always known or transparent as well in the public domains is the actions that organizations take with their own internal policies. Though many of these are often disclosed, this isn't what sort of grabs headlines in a sense in terms of the inner workings of an organization in terms of how we operate. So, for example, we have policies across the sectors that we operate, like many financial institutions do, around sustainability. And actually those translate into our client assessments and our credit approval process. So when a credit application actually comes in for a borrower at the corporate level, at the farmer level, there's actually a review of that organization's sustainability activities, given the sector they operate in, given their scope of their business, and across a variety of sustainability themes. And that actually plays a role with respect to the nature of the business we can do with that organization. And I think in some cases, that's the sort of inner working, if you will, that is should be more widespread, but is also often not as transparent. And I think what gets more attention is the fact of, what fraction of the bond market is actually sustainable linked financing and that kind of thing. I totally agree. But I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and several organizations, including ours, have been doing that work. And again, just not something that, very hard work to do, by the way, because it also means that from a competitive standpoint, you're basically taking a stand to not do certain types of business. And I think that's the kind of thing as well that that many organizations are taking stands around that need to be recognized.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tejon. I think you and Marcos both raised a really important point around the accountability piece and how do we actually make sure that financial institutions are held to standards around what it means for them to be able to integrate this work within their core business, to then be able to have that sort of domino effect in the markets. And I think we'll hear from Paulina a little bit later about how WBA is responding to that challenge. But would love to also, I think we have a question here around what else can governments, companies, other organizations, so when we speak about sort of the multi-stakeholder environment, how do we get them to help to incentivize financial institutions to go fully sustainable at the core? What's the missing piece of the puzzle? How do we tackle some of the challenges that Marcos talked about when it comes to maybe, different ways of speaking about these issues, language barriers? And I say language not as in English, German, and French, but different stakeholders and the way we think about these issues. Curious if anyone has any thoughts on that topic. Andre, it looks like you wanna come in.
Oh yes, I was just politely waiting if somebody else wanted to say something.
Go for it. Go for it.
Like I said last week when we discussed this also on a different level. I work for a bank for 7-8 years now. I'm quite happy to work for ABN AMRO. We were quite ahead on sustainability, but I talked to a lot of other banks also. And in the Netherlands, we're also quite ahead. But still, you see a banking perspective, a risk perspective from the risk models is quite short. If you lend money to a company, and of course, banks do much more complex financial things, but sometimes it's also about lending money to a company. The perspective is quite short, 2 years, maybe 5 years. So this perspective is most of the time much different than a sustainability risk perspective. So we look at the short perspective of the financing period. I've had this discussion 8 years ago with them, and they said, well, it's not a risk because over this period, it will not become risk, so therefore it's not a risk. So this awareness has to be created in the head of bankers that, and obviously the TCFD and so on are very helpful on that, and all standards on that, you have different kind of risks. You have physical risks, like TCFD said, but those are long term. You have also transitional risks and how it is perceived by society. And this influence will become bigger and bigger and very relevant, hopefully. But then on the other hand, all banks, I know Rabo, and I work a lot with Rabo and ABN AMRO, we're all looking for finding good projects to finance, green projects, the really dark green ones. And hopefully we can put all our money in that. And if they have a good return on investment, everybody is happy. To be honest, they're not there that much. Yeah, I work also for a subsidiary fund before that for the EU. And what you see there quite often, there are a lot of projects, a lot of sustainable projects, but not all of them have a return on investment, a normal within the even no return on investment. So it's not sometimes when I do presentations, banks are perceived sometimes in the Netherlands as subsidiary funds. We're not. We hope to finance our money the right way, sustainable way, get some return on investment and get our money back. So you need a lot of data for that, non-financial and financial data. Good projects are sustainable projects which give a certain amount of money back. And it's quite hard to find the dark green ones, but I think when you look at the transition, you don't only need the dark green ones, but you definitely need the light green ones, and maybe also turn the light gray ones into light green ones. And what you don't want to do is do the black ones, basically. And maybe so within the EU taxonomy, there's a lot of discussion about a brown taxonomy. I'm definitely in favor of a brown taxonomy. So you can have some sort of what is bad until what is good and gradually shift everything up. Don't only look for the best, only also look for the second best and see if you can turn that up one notch. And I think that will work better than only do the really sustainable stuff. But that's nice to do. It gives a great feeling. I mean, I've been there, I've looked at these projects, and we are able to finance such a project. You're happy. And I know people want to finance that. They have to be available, and the effect is bigger if you can move the whole mountain instead of a part of the mountain. I hope I make some clear.
You do, and it's really good. Sorry, did someone want to come in? No, okay. No, I think you make some really good points, and I think it's easier to move the mountain, as you said, when you have a range of stakeholders behind helping you to push in the same direction. So I think that's really useful. Shamila, I would love to turn to you next, maybe to come in, because I think that we've heard a lot about what's happening in the context of the EU, and also we had a little bit of hints of what's happening in the US, North America. But I think, South Africa has really been leading on a lot of issues around sustainable corporate governance and integrated reporting, actually, for a while now. And the Johannesburg Stock Exchange has been on the front lines of this movement. I think you also have a unique role to play in the context of the FFD discussions, given that you are the co-chair, the JSE of the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance, or the GISD Alliance, which is housed within the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So really would love to hear from you, what is your role as sort of a leading regional voice on this global stage looks like, and how has that helped to strengthen your own engagement at the JSE?
Thank you, Pratik, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the really significant Dutch presence, but I'll try keep up. It's great to be here, but thank you very much. It's been so fantastic to hear the other perspectives, and I think, I'm taking notes very carefully about where some of the precedents for action have actually emanated from within the different contexts, both from the corporate perspective as well as from the regulatory perspective. So from a JSE perspective, as you pointed out, we had to take a step back firstly and conceive of what was our role in furthering the aims of sustainable development. And, we quickly realized that our biggest effect was the sort of multiplier effect that we have from our standpoint. So we're really a connector between issuers and investors. Fundamentally, that's the role of the exchange, and that's its power. So how does one leverage that then to meet the aims of sustainable development? For me, the first step, if I have to look back, and I haven't been at the exchange for as long as the sustainability journey has been around, but I have been there for a number of years. If I had to reflect and think about it, I think the first step was leadership. And it was really, our former CEO who was bold enough to take the step and see that this was critical. At least it wasn't that she was a lone voice in some instances, because the imperative to act existed in our own economy, where huge, inequalities, deficiencies exist in the environmental and the social context. And so the sustainability issues were really front and center in terms of they're visible, they're tangible, they're not something that is going to happen at some point in the future. And therefore, the impetus to act doesn't exist right now. So we could see that firstly. Secondly, she needed to then say, well, what can we do as an exchange? Now, we were also in a position where as an exchange, there wasn't that much action happening from any of the exchanges globally in this area. So where do you take the first step? And indeed, why should you take the first step? Because it's always this careful consideration, and particularly if you go back sort of 14, 15 years ago when our journey started, where, the business imperative to act just wasn't as clear. And you'd be having the pushback with things like, well, if we, for example, were to put, certain potentially mandatory disclosures on our companies, does that then not create the risk of them delisting and going elsewhere? And that fundamentally affects the business of the JSE. But so the perspective was that how do we use then our role as a connector and an influencer to best impact? And then arrange those activities very carefully around effectively 4 areas. The first being looking at regulation. We are within the context of what we call a self-regulatory organization construct. And so we're a frontline regulator for issuers as the JSE, Chinese walls between the regulatory division and the other divisions within the company. Let's then look at the ecosystem. So what enables, for example, better disclosure? Disclosure would be the first point of action within that sort of ambit. So what was relevant to us? Disclosure was relevant. We had to look at the governance environment and go back to saying that better sustainability practices are really about good governance. Have you considered and applied your mind as the highest governing body in a company about what its risks are, what its opportunities are, and its actual value to society at the end of the day? And so that is where the JSE was fortunate that we were in an ecosystem where good governance was developing. The King codes of corporate governance, which are probably well known to most of you on the call today, was considered really a leading governance code in the world. But a code is a code with no teeth unless there's some kind of compliance regime, and King didn't have that. But the JSE then mandated that companies should actually start reporting in accordance with the King code, and so it became a listings requirement for JSE-listed companies to report in accordance with King in its various iterations. We had King 4 at this point, and the regime around that is apply and explain. So apply the recommendations of the code and explain why you have or haven't applied them. One of the key ones in relation to sustainability then is that companies need to explicitly consider sustainability concerns in their assessment of their business and report on how they've done that. We're not prescriptive about what framework you should use, be it GRI or TCFD or whatever, but we do say that the board needs to apply its mind. So that is codified in its governance requirements, and then apply how it's done that. Of course, you've mentioned already that integrated reporting is a recommendation of the King Codes, and so it's broadly cited globally that the JSE was the first exchange in the world to actually mandate integrated reporting. And to Andre's very well made point earlier, it creates a different perception when you're sitting with a standalone report, as opposed to integrating those considerations into your story of value creation. And so that is where, that has helped in that development in our market. It doesn't preclude you doing a separate sustainability report, but I think the idea there is that your core consideration should be a part of your main reporting. And if you wanted to supplement information so that you don't end up with a 600-page integrated report, you could then do so. So you double click perhaps in a separate report, but your core information and your value creation story sits in one place that is easy for stakeholders to understand. And that then makes the disclosure framework and everything else around how that enables stakeholder engagement to then flourish. Because once the information is in the public domain, it is equally accessible to everybody to use it as a basis for engagement, and therefore start acting on the different ways in which one can really try to promote sustainability and engage with companies on changing their business models and use those levers. Then if we look at the rest of the ecosystem, so that was one, was mandatory. We looked at tools and services. I won't go into detail, but we do a number of things. We allow for the reallocation of capital and the allocation of capital to more sustainable outcomes. The point's been made about green bonds, for example, but at least let's create the platform where an investor has some level of certainty from a regulatory perspective that there's a framework governing that. So once somebody labels it a green bond, who's saying that it's green or isn't? And is there some regulatory recourse should that not be the case in the longer term? And so that's where creating the right platforms, tools, and services in a regulated environment by an exchange has helped us. So we have green bonds, social bonds, sustainability bonds, and the first sustainability linked bond on the continent was actually issued on the JSE a few weeks ago. Self-labeled at this stage, but still a real precedent setter in terms of linking the cost of capital to sustainability outcomes and impact. And then, of course, advocacy and engagement. So how else do we advocate and engage within that ecosystem? We look at it end to end and say, financial services, looking at it from one end to the other, there are a number of actors and players, different aspects. You've got the asset manager, asset owner angle to look at as well. And so there we play a part in the broader ecosystem. We've got the codes for responsible investment South Africa. Again, not a mandatory or regulatory code of any sort, but served to support that broader development of the ecosystem in applying the minds of asset owners and asset managers as to what constitutes responsible investment. And so elements like this played together to try to create a more enabling environment. And the JSE then could use that context to say, where are we best placed to support, to develop that ecosystem, understanding that our small piece wasn't going to move the dial on its own, but that with these factors all together, there was opportunity to do that. And of course, within that is a huge amount of engagement with the regulators, with the government, wherever there's opportunity to do that, to try and bring in more guidelines, better reference points. And in that regard, for example, we're leading the Sustainable Finance Working Group under a piece of work that's been done by the National Treasury at the moment. And that's really acting on recommendations of a paper that was put out last year called Financing a Sustainable Economy. So there's benchmarks group, a taxonomy group, sustainable finance group, a TCFD group, and of course the capacity and competence building group. So we're working together with those different ones to say that this is relevant to all of us. And we're looking at reference points. And in a country like South Africa that often is a recipient of, for example, FDI and a lot of other foreign investment, the understanding by the market often is ahead of that of government in some instances. And so we would need to put in place solutions that work right now. And for example, a taxonomy could follow later on. But if you wanted to issue a green bond now, in the absence of a local taxonomy, how would one do that and maintain credibility? So particularly, there are many things that we do, but I hope that sketches for you a context of how we've seen that as the JSE, the role of leadership, the role of having some kind of context of operating, of understanding where you sit in the global context and trying to localize that and give credible world-class sort of opportunities, both from a governance perspective, but also from an investment perspective. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Shamila. That was quite the tour de force of explaining everything that JSE is doing, and I think really impressive. Congratulations also on the recognition recently on the bond that you just issued. That's great. And I think you made some really important points, including on this question around localizing context specific, because I think, as you said, in some cases, in South Africa, for example, the market's ahead of where government is. And that means that the way that you operate is not going to be based on what the EU is doing, but you're going to need to adapt that. And that's where I think, again, this multi-stakeholder environment where you have different stakeholders that are all sort of helping to push in the same direction can be really, really useful. I think you also made a really interesting other point around sort of the need for regulation, or the fact that regulation is important, but in the absence of an environment where regulation is able to be mandated, how do you help to at least create that enabling environment where regulation can then follow? And so I think this is a really good opportunity to pivot maybe to Marcos to talk about the work that you've been leading at UNDP to help pull a lot of these pieces together to push towards more of a globally recognized system of standards or norms on sustainability, disclosure, and reporting. I think that a lot of this has been in follow-up to last year's high-level meeting on financing for development. And of course, COVID has exacerbated much of the challenges that we're dealing with. But how has sort of the discussion that you've been leading as part of that working group and that process been sort of going over the past couple of months? Would love to hear sort of how that's progressing and what you're hearing from stakeholders throughout that process.
Thanks, Dick, and again, thanks for having us, and what a great conversation we're having here. Let me start by talking about the processes, right, and why they are relevant and important now. And then let me finish by talking a little bit about UNDP's own work to try to address some of the conversations and issues that we had in here. I think the context is well set. I'm not going to go there, right? We've all discussed it. Perhaps just adding a couple of things. One, there is a risk, which we already talk of, SDG washing, but there is another risk, which I think it is really dangerous and problematic risk for us at UNDP, right? And I think Shamila started to talk about that, with the risk that this entire evolution of sustainable finance will lock out, right, developing countries, especially least developing countries, small island states, from the sustainable finance. We'll lock capital out from those countries. As we put global standards, those standards must be designed in a way that not only allow capital to move to what is truly, ESG and sustainable, but actually allows capital to move to places, geographically speaking, where capital doesn't move today. Now, one big bottleneck of that, which we haven't talked, is the credit rating agencies. Because Andre and Teja and Shamila, they all deal with, the ratings that are issued by three companies, almost in a monopolistically way. And those ratings do not take into consideration the conversations we're talking about, right? So when it comes down to the geographical point of view, right? If we don't address the perceptions of risk, and in a lot of cases it's perception of risk rather than real risk, at a sovereign level, in a country like Ghana, or in a country like Malawi, in a country like Paraguay, and then on top of that, we put a series of standards in place for sustainable finance. The real risk right now is that we are shutting down entire countries from this market, and is it, I'm delighted to see, capital flowing to sustainable finance investments in Sweden or in the European Union. But if it only flows within the EU and it doesn't flow back to the developing countries, we are not going to achieve the SDGs. That's one important element and critical in the design of these standards, in the move to mandatory. The second one is SMEs. We can't expect it that whatever is being put in place to Andre or to Teja in the Rabobank and ABN applies the same for SMEs. But we also can't ignore SMEs, otherwise they will be shut out for the ABN bank loans as SMEs move towards that way. So we need to find a separate disclosure exercise which is compatible with the realities of SMEs in that sense, right? So I think those are two very important points that are in our mind as we are doing this work right now. Now, global processes, you've mentioned the FFT. The FFT ended last September with a second head of state, the Finance for Development, with a menu of policies. Now, those are not mandatory. Those are non-negotiated tests for those in the UN jargon. But the process was very interesting because by allowing for a non-negotiate text process, we end up with a lot of creative, innovative, cutting-edge policies that perhaps we wouldn't if we were dealing with a negotiated text. Now, this year, there are 6 clusters that are working under the Secretary General's office, the Prime Minister of Canada and Jamaica, to figure out how do we take those menu of policies to action, right? Now, country by country, region, and so on and so forth. We at UNDP are leading the class on sustainability and climate action, where the issues of global standards and norms are at the center, and we're delighted to have you as World Bench Alliance joining us on those processes, right? And what we're trying to do here is encourage international community to agree and formalize this common set of standards for non-financial reporting and calls on countries to commit to sustainable related disclosure framework, right? And helping conceptualize that. We at UNDP are receiving, you'll be surprised, in the last 18 months, the number of demands from developing countries that we are getting in terms of thematic bonds, help them structure bonds, to help them figure out taxonomies. All of that is going on. Now, that's the good news, right? Now, the bad news is we have seen a proliferation of initiatives around the world. Everything on disclosure, reporting, bonds, and these and that, and that has created a fragmented situation, which has created confusion. So part of what are we trying to do, both on the FFT, and then more important now, we are playing as UNDP, the secretariat of, as Marcel Hogg mentioned earlier, the Sustainable Finance Working Group at the G20, right? So that was reestablished by the Italian presidency as a study group in December, but last April 7th, the finance ministers and central bank governors meeting in its communique upgraded to a full-fledged working group, which allows now the working group, which is co-chaired by China and the United States. That's important. China and the US are co-chairing this group of the G20. So we are going to focus this year on climate first, right? Working very close with the Financial Stability Board, with IOSCO, with the IFIS, to avoid that duplication. What are we trying to do in the G20 now is to actually bring all of those things together, right? Not to coordinate the work of other institutions, enough of coordination, to be honest, as far as UNDP is concerned, but to really bring together the outputs. What is each one doing it? What is the roadmap of which one is doing? What are the gaps when new work needs to be done? By whom should that new work be done, right? And where can we see the future developing in a way that addresses that issues, the risks that I mentioned, both in terms of types of stakeholders like SMEs and types of country, because otherwise we're going to fail in this process. So the working group is working that way. We're going to have a couple of roundtables with private sector, so we can hear from you on what are the types of elements that need to be considered for the G20. And I think it is important. We are also discussing what are the incentives, right? So not only the elements of financial materiality, enterprise value, but because it is important that we create this process with dynamic materiality. Not everything today, as Andrea mentioned, has data, right? That is able to be quantified and put in the value of a company, right? On a financial materiality point of view. But in the end of the day, I would say that all of us want to make sure that the entire impact of a company in society is captured, right? And And let's be honest, 10 years ago, climate was not financial material. Now it is, TCFD. So, I can see a continuous evolution. Maybe it's the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure, which we together with UNEP-FI, providing secretariat, can become the next wave. But social issues, developing countries are saying they think needs to cover the S, not just the E of the ESG, right? So it's very, very important from that constituency that we also starting to look at the entire dynamic of double materiality of that aspect. A little bit about IOSCO's talking about that, while IFRS is still focused on the enterprise value, which is fine, provided others are thinking in its entirety. Now, let me give you quickly three things that UNDP is doing it, which I think also complement this conversation from the global process. One is we have an initiative called the SDG Impact, which I think Shamila knows, because we are launching in 2 days, soft launching together with the GISD, the first ever global SDG aligned investments platform, right? So we designed a methodology about 18 months ago. We tested in Brazil first, but it now has been done in 15 countries with 15 more coming this year, where we converted development needs or development plans and SDG plans into concrete investment opportunity areas, trying to begin to close that pipeline gap that Andre mentioned. Now, we are not going all the way to give Andre the due diligence in the name of the company he should consider, but we actually shrinking, if you want, the originational phase of the process. Now, we have more than 200 investment opportunity areas identified with return on investment, which SDGs are they delivering, all of that. And we're going to launch a database that would let Andre and Teja and anyone else to quickly search. We launched that on Wednesday morning, and it's joint UNDP GISG in that sense. Now, that same initiative of UNDP has put standards in the marketplace, right? Now, we look at the market and we said, the PRI standards, for example, are fantastic. There's $100 trillion, if I'm not mistaken, or $1 trillion, I don't know, not 100 trillion, but there's I don't know, $1 trillion of signatures to the PRI. Now, let's be honest, there's nothing wrong with the PRI standards. If that $1 trillion of signatures were actually performing on the real economy, the standards they sign up for, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Problem solved. So what happened between signing to standards like the PRI and reporting? There's disconnection in the middle. So we came in as UNDP and we create standards for private equity, for bonds, and for enterprises that try to deal with the decision-making process that happens for a company in between the signing and the reporting. So how you try to bring that signing to life, right? So for example, I'm delighted to say that the first bonds, SDG bonds, fully adhering to our bond standards was launched 10 days ago in China by the New Development Bank. $767 million fully adhere to the standards, right? For SDGs. We also support Mexico on an SDG bond and Indonesia, and we have a pipeline of thematic work going on around the world in that sense. The last piece of work that we try to do, perhaps to try to bring all together, is at the request of the G7, the French presidents, together with the OECD, they asked us to create some kind of sustainable finance framework. Now, not to try to duplicate it again, but something at a higher level that would look at what is going on around the world and say, what are the key bottlenecks and what are the key areas of work, right? We end up with 3 areas of work. Standards, which we talked a lot about it, how to unify as well as generate integrity to the standards, right? 2, policies, both carrots and sticks. Perhaps it is fiscal taxation incentives that needs to be put in place. And there is a conversation on the G20 about the role of fiscal policy, right? And then the third one is instruments, right? How can we consolidate bond, being the thematic bonds, being that, I'm a believer that we're going to see a lot of swaps going on because there's a debt crisis going on and we're going to have to deal with the debt crisis. And one opportunity of the debt crisis is to link that debt to SDGs or to climate or to anything else. So how does the instruments become more effective, efficient, and again, very important, accessible to developing countries, accessible to the countries that are outside the highways of finance around the world. And also domestic resource mobilization, right? That it's important that countries are able to raise money domestically as well in different forms. So that's a little bit, Pratik, of the work that we are doing as secretariats for FFD and G20, as well as our own work. And I'll invite all of you. There is a side event tomorrow morning, 7:30, on the FFD process. We're doing together with UNCTAD and ILO, agencies that are managing 2 other clusters. And then on Wednesday, we are launching with the GIST, the investors platform. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcos. And I mean, there was a lot to unpack in what you just said. So I know you said you just shared a little bit, but that was quite impressive. And I think so much that we can continue to have a discussion on. But I think the points that you made around specifically the need to sort of embrace, I know materiality is a contentious topic in these circles, but at least being aware of the fact that we can all agree on the issue around things potentially being important now that weren't important previously. And so having this understanding of dynamic issues that also reflect, making sure that standards reflect societal expectations is really important. There was a question that came into the chat box or the question box that I think is a nice segue into the work that WBA is doing. So Paulina, there was a question around what can we do to ensure that financial institutions deal in mainly sustainable financing? And WBA is doing some work now on launching an accountability piece that's looking to make sure that at least the world's largest financial institutions, so even though we understand, Marcos, of course, the need to make sure that SMEs and those organizations are also incorporated, but how can we at least make sure that the largest financial institutions are held accountable for their role in moving the markets towards sustainable outcomes? So Paulina, would love to turn over to you to maybe give us a little bit of a flavor of how we at WBA are looking at this topic.
Thank you, Pratik, and nice to see so many familiar and friendly faces on this panel. On behalf of WBA, thank you for your continued collaboration. We wouldn't be here having this amazing conversation if it wasn't for much of your support institutionally and personally, so thank you. I have the privilege of going not quite last, but nearly, and my mind is buzzing from everything that I've heard. There is so much to unpack. I'll try and bring some of it together, hopefully in my remarks, but mainly to address our finance system benchmark and how that might contribute to the complexity that we're currently seeing in the ecosystem. So thinking about the needs of the finance sector and the way in which it can finance a more inclusive, equitable and sustainable future, just listening to our speakers today, it's obvious that we have many more tools, some are voluntary and some are regulatory, that are available to support the transition of finance and the financing of the transition. And I think it's important to bear in mind the double role of the finance system in that. But until recently, investors who have been leading in this space have been setting much of their own path and on the whole setting their own standards around impact by using different frameworks and guidelines, be it SASB or GRI, looking at double materiality or not, and what is it ESG, is it impact, is it risk, all of those different questions. And I guess this is one of the reasons for the status quo highlighted by Marcos in his first remarks. And until now, there hasn't been much regulation of ESG reporting, and this is one of the reasons behind the current complexity and the patchwork approach to corporate ESG data, which is then often lacking in quality, consistency, and comparability. But there are, in our view, there are also a few other reasons. So ESG hasn't enjoyed the same status as financial reporting within companies, and we had a really good example from Tejal earlier. And then when companies do report, there isn't necessarily a system of ongoing accountability based on this reporting, nor a look at the systemic transformation, the progress that the company is making, or the impact on the people and the planet that can lead to. And this patchwork and complexity applies as much to financial services companies as others in different systems, be it beverage and food and agricultural companies or the heavy emitters, automotives, for example. So this is why we as WBA have identified 400 financial services firms that it will assess and rank through our finance system benchmark. These 400 are part of our overall cohort of 2,000 companies, all of which are influential and dominant in the systems in which they operate. But again, let's go back to the finance system. We're currently in the middle of developing our methodology and choosing the indicators that are needed to provide a universal benchmark that covers sustainability behavior of all of the 400 FS firms that are in our scope. So this includes insurance firms, banks, asset managers, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, some IFCs and others. We know, of course, that these are all hugely different institutions, but we also know from a lengthy consultation last year that there is a gap in this kind of a universal assessment. There are expectations of behavior that are cross industry and can be applied to these different industry companies. So we're looking at things like leverage and market signaling that is employed by the financial services company, but we're also looking at basic social impacts like human rights, social protection, and living wage. And these are applicable to other companies in other systems too. We also look at finance flows and the impact that large firms have in developing countries. That was an important point made by Marcus earlier. And we look at the operations and the supply chains. But of course, we also have our limitations, as noted by Pratik. We can't look at, in our assessment, we can't look at SMEs, for example. On the other hand, we also want to ensure that our measurements are as relevant to current discussions as possible, so that they're widely used, that they solve current systemic issues and help create a movement for business transformation. There was a question earlier about the way in which, how can you really integrate this into the thinking of financial services companies? And I think there isn't one silver bullet. It's lots of different actions that need to be taken. And there is this, for this reason, WBA is trying to establish a movement. So we can play a tiny little contribution to this, and everything else that we've heard on this panel. I think it's really important that those are things that are then taken forward, whether on a collaborative basis, on a regulatory basis, etc. But if I give an example of our relevance and what we're thinking through, thinking ahead to the work being done around COP26 this year and the commitments that we will probably hear around climate finance, we're supporting the establishment of an international panel for climate finance. And as part of this conversation, we're seeing how we can measure and provide accountability for the net zero finance commitments, which are evolving, for example, to be around having producing a TCFD report, companies having a transition plan, and then with science-based target initiative compliant targets too. So we need to now see how we can integrate these into our methodology, whilst also maintaining our broad focus on the SDGs rather than on just climate. So it's an ambitious task, it's not easy. And we've been lucky to have the support of everybody through our consultations. So we're not doing this on our own. And of course, our measurement and the way in which we can provide an accountability mechanism relies on good corporate disclosure. So bringing this back to our starting point and the regulation, we're really delighted with the reference to transparency and disclosure in this year's IATF report and also the draft FFD outcomes. Thank you, as this is really important in supporting global consistency with the work that we've heard is being done in the EU's in the EU with the NFRD and the IFRS Foundation and now the SEC as well. All of this is so important, as is the implied shift from voluntary to mandatory disclosures, not only as a means of improving peer competition in a race to the top, but also in improving board and executive accountability. The mandatory disclosures would provide the stick to increase competency to help elevate the status of ESG reporting right the way to the top of the companies. This will then help ensure the conversations between the global financial architecture or the supervisory bodies and the role they play in supporting the way that finance is transitioning itself. So we can't, it's not just the finance companies themselves operating in vacuum. What they hear, the market signaling from governments or the supervisory authorities, the the financial architecture that is also evolving needs to support the transition that we need to see from the finance sector. And we hope that this will mean that we have a more robust, integrated, and less of a patchwork, cherry-picking agenda approach to sustainability. And of course, that was also a question that came up earlier. But I'll stop there. Thank you again for everyone joining us today.
Thank you so much, Paulina. And open invitation, I think, as well for everyone to just let us know if you would like to learn more about the work that we're doing on the financial system benchmark. We'll be opening a consultation later this summer on the methodology for that benchmark. And so would love to include as many voices from this discussion as possible so that we make sure that the assessment is robust and incorporates all the different perspectives we talked about. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Brandt to wrap up the conversation and offer some last words. A tall task for you, Ambassador, I'm sure, given the breadth of the conversation. But maybe before I do that, would love to just maybe get one final sort of reflection from all of the other panelists so far. There was a reference earlier on, which I think was very appropriate for this conversation in terms of the need for all finance to be sustainable. And if we are able to do that, then we'll have done our jobs. What's the one thing that you would leave with participants that are listening to today's conversation that would help to get us to that point? Either something that you want to point to that you're working on, or a call to action or request. What's the one sort of thing that you would leave with participants? So maybe I'll go in reverse order, but maybe I'll start with Paulina again this time and then work backwards.
Thanks. Reporting for reporting's sake is not going to lead us anywhere. So where does that reporting lead to? What is the accountability and the actions that then get taken forward, and everybody working together based on that good quality reporting?
Great, thanks, Paulina. Marcos.
Perhaps I'm going to go in a different way. We're working for very large institutions, and we're working for all of this. But many of us in this room actually are investors. Okay, we give our money to a third party to invest our pension funds or to invest our retirement funds or whatever. All of us have, if we are serious about this, as consumers of financial services, what are we waiting to hold accountable the people that made our money, to demand from them to give us products that are sustainable, that are ESG? That, you know, I've done that in the last 18 months with my financial manager, if you want, here in the United States. And trust me, it was an education because he had no idea what I'm talking about. And he manages thousands of clients, right? Or hundreds of clients. So I've educated him, who's now selling to others this stuff. So as individuals, consumers, you have a responsibility to hold whoever manages your money, your investors, accountable, and honestly, make them invest your money in this way.
Well said. Thanks, Marcos. Shamila, over to you.
So I hate to say it, but I was going to say something very similar to what Marcos said, because I think ultimately it comes down to your own awareness as an individual. Because what you will then do in your actions, in your professional life, in every other sphere of influence is going to be, it's going to be pushed by that awareness and that understanding. Because I think once one understands the sustainability challenges, the pressing need to change. I mean, we talked today about the climate crisis. We didn't maybe go into detail talking about the biodiversity crisis, but that is obviously a massive one coming, particularly when you consider just from a jobs perspective, the number of jobs that are directly related to the natural environment. It is staggering when one considers that. But when we have that awareness, I think that it becomes difficult not to act in every sphere in which you influence. So I think that awareness creation for me on a personal level and maintaining that all the time, and then being true to acting on that in your professional environment and every other engagement socially as well, is going to be one of those levers. And maybe not what you expected to hear from me, but I really do believe that that is one of the big catalysts for change.
Great, thanks, Shamila. Tejal, over to you.
Just really quickly, very good point so far. I think when we talk about the word sustainable, we've heard on this conversation the fact that there are so many stakeholders that we're talking about, those who feel the impacts of climate change and other ills and other issues. And I think we just need to not focus on one theme or one end around sustainability, but think about sort of externalities and the impacts that certain initiatives that achieve a sustainable goal have that could be perhaps adverse in other realms, and just make sure we're considering all of that.
Great. And Andres, really quickly, if you have one thing to say.
Yes, well, I've been advising on sustainability for almost 30 years, and I've seen a lot of developments from ISO 14000 in the 90s, the first milieuwetgeving in the Netherlands, early 90s. Bottom line is, in my opinion, good legislation. So the EU start is very good, and good data, good available data. This combination, obviously the carrot and the stick, but if you want everything to become sustainable, you definitely need good legislation.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Brandt, I'll turn it over to you for the final word. I know this is a very, very busy week for you, so really appreciate you joining us as well. Would love to get your final thoughts on the conversation so far and what this means for the FFT process and the conversations that are happening this week.
Well, thank you very much, Pratik, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I'd like to also thank all the presenters for your excellent contributions and for a very, very interesting discussion. I don't think I'm even going to attempt to try and wrap up such a rich discussion. So I have to disappoint you there, Pratik. But I'm very happy to share a few thoughts from the Netherlands at the end of this, what I think is a very important and timely debate, also in the light of the forum that is about to start in half an hour, as you know. And the Netherlands really feels that that's what this debate is, important and timely. So when it comes to the benchmarks, we feel that they can be a really powerful tool and also a good starting point for a dialogue and discussions as we're having right here, so that we can have these discussions like an evidence-based conversation with the private sector. And ultimately, it's about how we can team up to do the work together. So also in the interest of time, I'd just like to briefly touch upon 4 points. I think, first of all, the urgency for change is very clear. The UN Secretary General had initiated the decade of action because the world is simply not moving fast enough to achieve the SDGs. The financing gap was already huge, and we've now been further set back by the pandemic. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the SDGs as a framework do not provide us with goals, but also with a roadmap for change and recovery the world needs, and with a roadmap for the sustainable investment that the world needs. And I like what Marcel said in the beginning. We simply cannot afford to postpone solutions any further. So secondly, and I think it was Paulina who also touched upon it, I can't remember, but we believe that we should not just view these benchmarks in isolation, but also link them to discussions and concrete solutions to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and how to make progress on the path towards a circular economy, because this is simply the only viable way forward. Third, and I think many of you made this point, it's only through strong multi-stakeholder partnerships that we can achieve our common goals. And it's therefore great also to see today that such a diverse group of speakers and participants are with us for this event. And we can only achieve the SDGs if we massively scale up innovation and investment. And for that, we need all the stakeholders, both also public and the private sector, So what the Dutch government does is when it encourages private companies to invest in sustainable development, we're also backing these efforts up with public investments. And my last point, well, it's great to see, that so many companies are already making real efforts to align their business models with the SDGs and report on that. And we've seen really, we've heard really great examples of this also this morning. And I really liked the point that were made about impact, and it's just not reporting for the sake of reporting, and the importance of moving, from a niche issue to a core business, to the core business, and to also be able to show that in reporting. So not a sideshow, but the main show in town, so to speak. Because I think one of the problems is that all these efforts, or of course, by extension also the lack thereof, will go unrecognized. And here the point also of accountability, I think, comes in, because publicly available benchmarks will inform not just companies, but also and investors, and stakeholders, but also the public at large about whether we're now making progress or not. And measuring will help us set these standards together. And obviously we need to make sure that the benchmarks are produced and used in the spirit of true partnerships. And that's why the work of the WBA is so important. And we're so happy to be a proud partner of WBA. Well, as the Netherlands, we expect that these partnerships and dialogues, including the one we're having today, will have a positive impact and contribute to more businesses working for the achievement of the SDGs. And I think if there's one lesson we should take from this pandemic, is that we need to think about the long-term effects of the choices that we make. And that means investing now in a green, deep green, light green, and just recovery to get us back on the path towards the SDGs. And I think what this session has shown us once more is that having these global sustainability disclosure standards will help us get there, as it can create an incentive for allocating capital more effectively towards the goals of the 2030 agenda. Because after all, as we say in Dutch, meten is weten, which roughly translates as to measure is to know. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Brandt, and very well said, and really appreciate again your participation in this panel, especially given everything happening this week. And we're looking forward to seeing the outcome document at the conclusion of the forum. And also it was an accident, I should say as well, that we had such a strong Dutch contingent, but great to see the leadership of the Netherlands on this agenda. So I should also say thank you to all our panelists for joining. I mean, it was such a rich and robust conversation, and I wish we had more time to delve into all of the topics raised, but really good to know that all of you are working in such close coordination with each other and with broader stakeholders to, I think Marco said it nicely, bring integrity to this process, and really looking forward to continuing to work with all of you on this agenda moving forward. Thank you also to all of our participants who joined. Really looking forward to continuing the discussion with you as well. Feel free to reach out to us if you would like to explore any of these topics in more detail. You can reach out to us on any of our social media channels or by email. And wishing you all a very productive and enjoyable FFD forum, and look forward to connecting again soon. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.